And then they said, you know what, I have a better idea. You get out, I'm taking your house. I mean, it would be absolute chaos. Now, are there some police officers who go over the line and do things? Of course there are. Are there some plumbers who go over the line? Are there some teachers who go over the line? Are there nurses who go over the line? There are all kinds of people, because people are imperfect. Do we demonize the whole group of anybody because of something that one person does? Why would we do that with the police who protect us? That doesn't make any sense. Well, at any rate, you know, my mother was the one who was the real hero. And you know, I want to thank all the people who prayed for my mother. You know, on the day of my announcement, we went down to Texas to start making funeral arrangements, and so many people were praying for my mother. She's back. She came back. So I appreciate it. But, you know, she was very disturbed by my poor academic performance and my brother's. She didn't know what to do. So she prayed, and she asked God for wisdom. And you know, that's the wonderful thing about God. You don't have to have a PhD to talk to him. You just have to have faith. And God gave her the wisdom, at least in her opinion. My brother and I didn't think it was all that wise. I mean, turning off the TV, what kind of wisdom is that? Making us read 2 books apiece from the Detroit Public Libraries and submit to her written book reports, which she couldn't read, but we didn't know that. You know, she put check marks and highlights and underlines, and we would think she was reading them, but she wasn't. But you know, here's what was important. I didn't like it very much at first, but we were desperately poor. And between the covers of those books, I could go anywhere. I could be anybody. I could do anything. My horizons expanded tremendously. I began to know things that nobody else knew. And most importantly, I came to the understanding that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. And I stopped listening to all the naysayers and the people who were saying that this is against you and that's against you and you can't do this. I didn't have time for them. I was too busy reading. I was too busy preparing myself. And it made all the difference in the world. Within the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all the students who used to call me dummy and laugh at me, who were now coming to me saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? And I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, I had a very different impression of who I was. And I was starting to use that brain, the human brain, the most amazing organ system in the universe. Your brain has billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard, can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. You can't overload it. People say, don't learn this, don't learn that, you'll overload your brain. You can't overload the human brain. If you learned one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to challenge the capacity of your brain. Don't have to worry about that. And with brains like that, shouldn't we be able to solve our problems? And we need to be able to emphasize again, how do we solve those problems? And we have to do it together. One of the things we as Americans must recognize is that we are not each other's enemies. And we have to stop letting the purveyors of division come in and stoke up all of this animosity. Just because someone doesn't agree with you does not make them your enemy, does not make them somebody that you're supposed to be trying to destroy. That makes no sense whatsoever. And particularly at a time when we have radical jihadists who are trying to destroy us, why would we help them by trying to destroy each other? Anybody in our society who is trying to stroke up division is our enemy. They are assisting the enemy. We do not want that. We certainly don't want to become one of those individuals. But you think about how they managed to create so much havoc in our society. political correctness, as you know, is something that I detest. And why do I detest it so much? Because there were a lot of people who gave their lives so that we could have freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And we dishonor them. We dishonor them when we don't take advantage of the freedom that we have. That doesn't mean that we should go around trashing people and saying nasty things, although we do have a right to do that. We shouldn't do that because that's a sign of immaturity. People who generally don't have a good argument resort to calling people names and acting like third graders. Apologies to any third graders who are here. You know, that is not becoming of the nation that we are and that people fought for. This is a nation that in 1831, Alexis de Tocqueville came to study because the Europeans were fascinated. They wanted to know how a fledgling nation, barely 50 years old, was already able to compete with them on virtually every level. Nothing like that had ever happened before. So he was going to figure out what was going on over here. One of the things that really impressed him was how educated the American people were. Anybody finishing the second grade was completely literate. He could find a mountain man on the outskirts of society, and the guy could read the newspaper, could tell him how the Constitution worked, could have an intelligent conversation. Only the aristocracy in Europe was able to do that. And it's that being informed and being knowledgeable that made such a big difference in our country. That's how those early settlers were able to move from one sea to the other against a rugged and hostile terrain. They knew how to build roads and bridges and containment facilities and dams. They knew how to invent things when a new problem came up. They had the can-do spirit that elevated us to the pinnacle, which is in the process of being replaced now with the what can you do for me spirit, which will take us down. And we have to stop it before it infests the whole country. And for those people who say we're not an exceptional nation, I think they need to read a little more. Because 100 years before this nation came on the scene, 1,000 years, 3,000 years, 5,000 years, people did things the same way. Within 200 years of the advent of America, men were walking on the moon. We fundamentally changed the trajectory of mankind on the face of the earth. We are the most exceptional nation the world has ever known, and we should be proud of it. Now, as such, we need to protect that nation, and we need to make sure that it remains an exceptional nation for those who are coming behind us. And therefore, we must enter the dialogue about those things that threaten our future, including gross fiscal irresponsibility. You know, we have an $18.4 trillion national debt. I mean, that is such a staggering amount of money, $18 trillion. If you tried to pay that back at a rate of $10 million a day, 365 days a year, it would take you 5,000 years. And we are putting that on the backs of our young people. But that's the good news. That's the good news. There is something called the fiscal gap. When you go home today, I want you to look up the fiscal gap. It talks about what we as a nation are liable for going forward. Social Security, Medicare, government programs, departmental programs. What do we owe? We don't put that stuff on the books. And what are we due in terms of taxes and other revenues? There's a big difference between those two numbers. That's what essentially the fiscal gap is. Right now, it sits at $250 $11 trillion. Now, I mentioned that during my announcement speech. And the next day, some of the liberal media came out and said, what is he talking about? He has no idea what he's talking about. Doesn't know anything about economics. He's just an alarmist. You don't have to worry about that stuff. And then the day after that, an article came out, I think it was Bloomberg, that said 17 Nobel laureates in economics and 1,200 economics professors agree with Carson. And it is clearly something that we need to talk about. And it is not a partisan issue, because what is going to happen with that kind of unsustainable debt will not discriminate between Democrats and Republicans. It will destroy the financial foundation of this nation for everyone. And unless we get serious about it and start dealing with it, we are going to succumb to it. And it is possible to fix. You know, a few years back, Italy had an even wider fiscal gap than we did. But to their credit, they had enough sense to enact wide-ranging policy changes, changing the age of retirement and reducing the pensions by 40%. Now, that's painful. And I'll tell you something, it's not nearly as painful as what we're going to have to do if we don't get a grip on this. You know, we have to do it now. The longer we wait, the more painful it is going to be. And we have to start thinking in a wise way. We have the most powerful economic engine the world has ever known in this country. But we are putting all kinds of chains and fetters on it so that it can no longer work. You know, can you remember the time when everybody would be so excited when they started their own business and they'd call their mom up, "Mom, I started a business, I got 10 employees. And the next week they had 20 and then 30 and then 40. But now when they get to that 40, oh, better stop. Don't want to get to 50 because then all of those mandates kick in. You know, is that conducive to growth? Is that conducive to the backbone of our economic strength, the small businesses? Of course it isn't. We cannot have policies that destroy the incentive to build business in our country. That makes absolutely no sense. And then we have the highest corporate tax rate, in the developed world. And we have people like our Secretary of Treasury saying that companies that do business overseas to avoid paying the high American taxes are unpatriotic. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that people in our administration do not know who we are. This is a capitalist economy. It is not a socialist economy. They need to understand that. If they want socialism, they need to go to Cuba or someplace like that. You know, we're not changing who we are to accommodate somebody who wants to fundamentally change America. We are who we are, and we rose to the pinnacle because of who we are, and we don't need to throw that away. Having said that, there's over $2 trillion sitting overseas right now, American capital, which they would love to bring back to this country if they didn't face that 35% tax. What I would do is I would declare a tax holiday for 6 months to allow that money to be repatriated, with the only stipulation being that 10% of it would have to be utilized to create jobs for unemployed people and people on welfare. You want to talk about a stimulus. That would be a stimulus that wouldn't cost the American taxpayer 1 penny. That's what we have to start thinking about. And then all the regulations. There are a gazillion regulations around everything. Every month, new regulations coming out, encircling business, industry, academia. Anybody who doesn't cooperate with the government, you just pull the noose on them and strangle them. That's what happens in communist countries. How did that happen in this country? How did we let that happen? We need to roll back a lot of those regulations. Some of them are necessary. As our founders said, you know, no government would be necessary if men were angels. But men are not angels, and neither are women. In case there are any Hillary supporters out there. So we do need regulations. There's no question about that. But not in every aspect of our lives. And then the tax structure is not conducive to the growth of small business. You know, the thing that feeds the economic engine is an environment that encourages entrepreneurial risk-taking and capital investment. And if you don't have those things, the engine dies. And the tax structure is one of the things that does that. Our tax system structure is described in an 80,000-page document. That is ridiculous. Nobody can comply with all of that. We need something that is very simple, very straightforward, and very easy to comply with, so that we don't need a complicated system like the IRS. And I would favor a system. I would favor a system based on godly principles. You know, God talked about a tithe in the Bible, which is a proportional tax system. So everybody pays according to their ability. So if you make $10 billion a year, you pay $1 billion. You make $10 a year, you pay $1, but you get the same rights. Why is that complex? That's not complex at all. Now, in order to make it truly fair, you have to get rid of all the deductions and all the loopholes, because some people can get them and some people can't. And some people get very nervous when I say something like that. They say, I can't make it without my mortgage deduction. They're not thinking it through, because the amount of money that they would save would be much greater than what they get back in their mortgage deduction. And then there are some who say, it doesn't hurt the guy who made $10 billion. Why do you need to hurt him? He just put $1 billion in the pot. You don't need to hurt him. You need to create an environment so that next year he can put $2 billion in the pot. And then there are people who say, but the guy who makes $10, he can't afford to pay $1. Of course he can afford to pay $1. You know, I grew up amongst the very poor, and I can tell you something. Poor people also have pride. And we can't just pat them on the head and say, there, you poor little thing, we're taking care of you. That's not what they want. What they want is fairness, and they want a fair shake, and we have to provide them with a mechanism to move up the ladder and become part of the fabric of this nation. And it's all about being fair. It's about being fair to everybody. We don't pick and choose who we're going to be fair to. And I think that's going to alleviate a lot of animosity. We also need to recognize, you know, some people say with the system that I just described, there'll be no more charitable giving, because they assume that the only reason that people give to charities is because they want a tax deduction. Do they know anything about the history of this country? Do they realize that we were a very generous country before 1913, when the federal income tax was done? We have always taken care of each other. The reason this nation thrived early on, communities that were separated from each other by hundreds of miles, why did they thrive? Because people cared about and took care of their neighbors. If somebody fell out of the apple tree during harvest time, everybody else harvested his crops and took care of his family. Somebody got killed, they took care of their families. We have always taken care of our own. We will always take care of our own. It is our duty to take care of the downtrodden. It is not the duty of the government. And perhaps, and I'm not anti-government at all, but I want a government that reads and understands our Constitution and understands what it is supposed to do. And one of the things I would be very interested in doing is, you know, there's just been a real shift in power between the states and the government. Why not have the government block grant back to the states at 80% for all the various federal programs, and let the states handle it, and then tell them that any money they have left over, they can do with what they please. That will create real efficiency, and also those people are directly responsible to the citizens in their state who are going to be watching very closely what they're doing. That's the way it was intended. It was never intended for the federal government to be in all aspects of our lives. They've got enough to do to protect us, which is one of their biggest jobs, and they're not doing it the right way. You know, our electrical grid needs to be not only hardened, but we need to have multiple alternatives. We need to have cybersecurity, because look what happened a couple of weeks ago with them being able to get all the federal employees' information. We need to have a vigorous cyber program, not only defensive, but offensive. And if anybody attacks us, we need to be able to disable them almost immediately, because that may be only phase one of what they're getting ready to do. And our country is very vulnerable. We are extremely vulnerable. Our Navy's at its smallest size since 1917. Recently, with the troubles in Yemen and the Houthi going over there, and we're worried about it falling under Iranian control, and we sent a carrier group there. But it was the Roosevelt, it was the same carrier group that was supporting the efforts in Iraq. And instead of being able to send another carrier group, we need to have the ability to do multiple things in multiple parts of the world. And as far as ISIS and the radical Islamic jihadists are concerned, they want to destroy us. That is their goal, to destroy us and our way of life. We have two choices. We can sit around and let them get stronger and bigger while we deteriorate and allow them to accomplish their goal, or two, we can destroy them first. I'm for number two. And I would describe myself as a dove, but I'm what's known as a pragmatic dove. That means you don't sit around and let somebody destroy you. You get rid of them. But, you know, we really need to take a real stand on the world stage, because when we vacate our responsibilities as the pinnacle nation in the world, that space will be filled by someone else. And the likelihood that they will be as benign as we are is extremely remote. So when we look at somebody like Putin, who has big aspirations, we shouldn't just wait until he does something. You know, in 2008, when he invaded Georgia, did he ever leave? No. And then in 2013, when he took Crimea and then eastern Ukraine, you know, and what are we doing? Well, maybe we can have some, maybe a sanction. Let's make sure they can't use their visa. I mean, just stupid stuff. This is stupid stuff. We're not doing anything. Now, what we should do is we should look back to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And we could say, what caused the collapse of the Soviet Union? It was an economic collapse, because they could not compete with us in the race for weapons. Now, what is their financial base right now? Energy. They are a one-horse show. So that's how we bring them under control, with energy. This country has been blessed with enormous energy. We have so much, we don't even know what to do with it. And we have these energy exportation rules, which are archaic from the 70s when we had an energy crisis. We need to get rid of those. We have the ability to liquefy natural gas now, which means it can be exported. We need to get the XL pipeline going. We need to find, the EPA needs to be used to work with business, industry, and academia to find the cleanest, most environmentally friendly ways to utilize the tremendous resources that we have. And some of that money can be used to fund research into alternative energy, into green energy. We don't have to make that into a them versus us thing. We can do more than one thing at a time, because we will eventually need other energy sources, so we should be working on those things simultaneously. That's why we have complex brains that can do more than one thing at a time. And, you know, we should stop allowing the manipulators to take this and make it into a big issue. They make everything into an issue. But if we make Europe dependent on us for energy, it vastly decreases Putin's influence, and we can put him back in his little box where he belongs. You know, that's the kind of thing that we need to be thinking about. We need to be proactive in everything that we do and stop being reactive. There's so many other areas, education, immigration, that we need to be addressing, utilizing our resources in an appropriate way to give people good health care. And we can do that. We've got the money to do it. We spend almost twice as much per capita as other nations on health care, and yet we have terrible access problems and inefficiencies. And you know, I've described ways for us to take care of that. And you can find it at our website, bencarson.com. Please go there. And you know, we need people to get fully involved, because if we're going to save this nation, every one of you has to be involved. Just like in the pre-revolutionary days, when you know, people were tired of the tyrannical dictates of King George III, and the settlers, they started getting together. The patriots, they would call for town hall meetings in their barns and in the center of the city and in their garages or whatever they had. They even invited the loyalists. And they would talk about what kind of America did they want to have? What were they willing to fight for? What did they want their children and their grandchildren to have? And they encouraged each other. And it is through that encouragement that a ragtag bunch of militiamen was able to defeat the most powerful and professional army on the face of the earth. And this is what we must do again today. We have to stop being afraid. Freedom is not free. You have to fight for it every day. Thank you.
All right.